The Mercer Casino didn't run on luck, it ran on debt. And on that particular Saturday night, the deepest debtor in the room was a man named Garrett Hale, who'd just gambled away more than his own life was worth, and decided the cheapest way to settle it was to sell his stepdaughter. Delia Quinn was 27 years old and had spent most of those years learning how to take up as little space as possible. A forensic accountant who could spot a lie buried 6 layers deep in a balance sheet, but couldn't get a single member of her own family to look her in the eye. She'd lost her job 2 years back for catching something she wasn't supposed to catch, and ever since then, the world had treated her like a woman who'd already used up her one chance to matter. She stood at the center of that glittering underground room, in a dress that wasn't hers, under chandeliers that cost more than a year of her rent, while Garrett held her wrist like a man presenting an item at auction. And the wealthiest, ugliest people in Chicago laughed the way people laugh when they're certain the joke won't ever be aimed at them. Her mother stared into a glass of champagne, her younger sister looked at the floor, and Garrett, drunk on whiskey and on the sound of his own voice, announced that a full year of this quiet, plain, forgettable gore, her labor, her loyalty, whatever a man cared to take, would go to whoever covered his debt, starting the bidding at a number designed to humiliate her rather than save him. Nobody expected the voice that answered. It came from the dark of the upper balcony, low and unhurried, a voice that didn't rise because it had never once in its life needed to. $1.2 million check. The laughter died in a single breath. Every head in the room turned toward the man stepping out of the shadows, and the temperature of the place seemed to drop with him. Thorne Mercer was 37, built like something carved out of cold patience, with dark hair shot through with early silver, and eyes the flat gray of a loaded gun, and he was a name people in that city said quietly, if they said it at all, because the families who'd crossed the Mercers tended to stop existing. He didn't smile. He didn't bargain. He simply set a check down on the green felt table, the way a man lays down a winning hand he was always going to play, and the entire room went so silent you could hear the ice settle in 100 abandoned glasses. He wasn't looking at Garrett. He wasn't looking at the money. He was looking, with a focus that made the breath catch in Delia's throat, directly at her, as though every cruel soul in that room had simply ceased to exist. And the question that hung in the perfumed air, the question that would unravel 2 families, 1 corrupt empire, and everything Delia thought she knew about her own worth, was painfully, dangerously simple. Why would a man like that pay a fortune for a woman the world had decided was worth nothing? If a story about the people everyone overlooks, and the dangerous man who finally saw one of them, is the kind of story you'd stay up too late for, do me a favor and hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Now let's step back into that casino, into the silence after the check hit the table, and find out exactly what Thorne Mercer wanted. The check lay on the green felt table like something more alive than any of the people in the room, and in that breathlessly long moment, no one dared to move. Thorne Mercer didn't look at the money. He didn't look at Garrett, who stood frozen with his mouth half open in the middle of some smug sentence that had died before it could finish. He only kept his eyes on Delia for one more beat, then said, in that low, deep voice that didn't need to rise to make the whole room listen, that his car would come for her at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. He didn't ask. He didn't add a single word to soften the command, not one gesture to suggest this was an invitation she had the right to refuse. He simply declared it the way a man reads aloud, a truth already carved into stone, then turned away, and his tall figure disappeared into the dark passage behind the balcony so quickly that later Delia would wonder whether she had imagined the whole thing. It took the room several seconds to remember how to breathe again. Then the murmuring rose, soft at first, then breaking open into a feverish current of whispers, the wealthy people who had been laughing only moments earlier now leaning close together to gossip about the Mercer name, as though they had just watched something dangerous cross the room and leave behind the smell of smoke. Garrett was the first to wake from his stupor. He rushed to the table with naked greed, his thick fingers snatching up the check, smoothing it flat, reading the number again and again, as if he feared it would evaporate the second he looked away. $1,200,000. His face shifted through every shade, from horror to disbelief, then into a fat, sickening joy, and when he looked up he even laughed, a short, shrill laugh from a man who had just convinced himself that fortune had finally smiled on him. He didn't look at Delia. Throughout the fateful moment that had turned her entire life inside out, the man who had pushed her onto that stage didn't even bother to glance at her once, because to him she had never been a person. She was only a number on a sheet of paper, and now that number had just been converted into the only thing he truly loved. Delia remained motionless in the middle of the floor, beneath the blinding crystal chandeliers, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. She waited for the familiar humiliation to rise inside her, that instinctive desire to shrink until she disappeared completely, a reflex she had sharpened over all those years. But this time something else slipped in between the shame, something she didn't have a name for. The man with silver threaded through his hair had seen her, not looked through her the way her mother always did, not looked at her like a burden the way Garrett always did, but looked straight at her, as if in that whole room filled with silk and diamonds, she was the only thing worth setting his eyes on. The feeling warmed her in a strange way and chilled her spine at the same time, because she had lived long enough to know that when something good arrived without a reason, its price was always hidden somewhere she hadn't yet seen. Her mother, Margot, drifted past her on the way to the door with the crowd, her eyes brushing Delia for an instant, before quickly sliding away as if she had touched fire, while Brooke, her beautiful half-sister, managed only to throw her a confused look before the tide of people carried her away. No one said a word to her. No one asked whether she was all right. They drove her back to Garrett's house in silence, and she quietly climbed up to the small room at the end of the hallway, the old storage room he had shoved her into years ago, then sat on the edge of the bed with her trembling phone in her hand. She typed that name into the search bar. Thorne Mercer. The results that appeared made her breathing slow. A few half-removed articles, a few names of shell companies, one single photograph taken from a distance with half his face buried in shadow, and beneath it all, rumors written in the cautious language of people afraid of the very thing they were writing about. An empire built on dirty money, rivals who vanished, a man no one truly knew, except enough to stay away from him. Delia set the phone down, her palm damp with sweat, and for the first time in 2 years of living like a shadow, since the day she was driven out of the accounting firm for daring to uncover something she should have pretended not to see, she felt something she had thought she'd lost long ago. Not hope. Curiosity. Why her? Why would a man like that spend an entire fortune on someone the whole world had already decided wasn't worth a single cent? The entire next day passed in a silence so heavy that Delia could almost hear it ticking inside the walls. And it wasn't until close to 7 o'clock in the evening that Garrett finally stepped into her small room without knocking, his usual glass of liquor in hand, his face restored to the smugness of a man who believed the entire universe had just been rearranged to serve him. He leaned against the doorframe, looking her up and down with the cold, appraising expression he had reserved for her since the day he married her mother, then told her she needed to know her place and behave properly tonight. He told her that a connection to a fortune that size could lift this whole household to a level he had never dared dream of, that all she had to do was be obedient, make that man happy, and not open that stubborn mouth of hers and ruin this heaven-sent stroke of luck. He reached out and gripped her shoulder the way he always did, whenever he wanted to remind her who held the power, his fingers pressing through the thin fabric. But this time, because of something she didn't understand, something that had shifted inside her after that look from the night before, Delia shoved his hand away. The gesture was small, almost nothing at all, but it made both of them go still, because in all those years, she had never dared. She lifted her eyes and looked straight into his with a calmness she didn't even know where she had found, and said very softly that he was the one who had put her up for sale as a joke, so he had no right to teach her how to behave properly. Garrett's face flushed red, his mouth twitching as if he were about to spit out something cruel, but at that exact moment the doorbell rang, steady and chillingly punctual, and he swallowed his anger along with the last of the liquor in his glass. Outside, beneath the streetlights blurred by the early evening mist, a sleek black car was waiting, the driver silently opening the door for her without a word, without even a glance. Delia crossed the threshold of Garrett's house without looking back, drew in a deep breath of the cold, damp evening air, then sat down inside the dark belly of the car, and let the door close behind her like the shutting of one chapter of her life. For the long drive, the car glided smoothly through the lit streets of Chicago, and then gradually left the brightness behind, while Delia sat with her hands tightly interlaced in her lap, trying to predict what she was about to step into. At last, the car stopped at the foot of a glass tower rising into the night sky, and a private elevator carried her straight to the highest floor, opening into a vast space drowned in shadow, lit only by an entire wall of glass overlooking the glittering sea of city lights stretching all the way to the horizon. Thorne Mercer stood there with his back to her, a tall, motionless silhouette against the glowing skyline, one hand holding a glass of amber liquor he hadn't touched. He didn't turn around right away. He let the silence stretch long enough for her to fully feel how small she was in that space, and only then did he speak, still in that low, deep voice, saying that she was trying to calculate what he wanted from her. It wasn't a question. Delia tightened her hands and answered that she'd be a fool not to wonder why a man with his reputation would spend more than $1 million to buy 1 year of her company. He turned around when he heard that, and for the first time she saw his face clearly beneath the dim light rising from the city, the cold, sharp lines, the gray eyes so still they were frightening, studying her not with desire, not with pity, but with a calm focus that made her feel as though she were being peeled apart layer by layer. He said she wasn't a fool, even though her stepfather had spent a lifetime trying to convince her of the opposite, and that blunt sentence cut through the defensive walls she had spent decades building, touching a nerve so deep that she gave a faint shiver. He didn't threaten her, he didn't pity her either. He only stood there, cold and absolutely composed, and somehow that unsettled her more than both of those things combined, because she couldn't read what this man wanted. And for someone whose entire life had been built on reading what other people tried to hide, there was nothing more terrifying than a question she couldn't solve. Delia opened her mouth to answer, but Thorne had already set his glass down on the glass table, with a soft click and spoken first, saying he would give her the answer she was starving for, because he wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed playing vague little games with a mind like hers. He took a few steps toward her, slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, and asked whether she still remembered a winter afternoon 2 years earlier, when she had still been a low-level audit assistant at Whitlock and Greaves, sitting tucked into the corner of a conference room full of men in expensive suits who were nodding along and praising one another. Delia's breath stopped. Of course she remembered. She remembered every detail of that afternoon, the way a person remembers a scar. It had been an audit contract for a chain of shell corporations, a thick stack of financial reports that the entire room of senior experts had approved, after nodding that every figure matched, every number was clean, everything was perfect. And she, the little assistant no one even bothered to remember by name, had timidly raised her hand in the middle of that room to point out one thing. A small cash flow, cleverly disguised through 4 layers of subsidiaries and 2 different jurisdictions, a discrepancy that looked entirely harmless at a glance, but if traced the right way, exposed an entire money laundering machine operating right under the noses of the people being paid generously not to see it. She had presented her discovery calmly, precisely, one step at a time, and in return she received the frozen silence of the whole room. Then the scoffing laugh of the lead auditor, the man who swept her analysis aside like a fly and told her she had read it wrong, that she was too inexperienced to understand transactions this complex. 3 weeks later, she was dismissed with a reason carefully worded on paper, her file was sealed, and the reputation of a troublemaker clung to her long enough that no firm in the city dared to hire her again. That was the beginning of 2 years of living like a shadow, 2 years drifting from one temporary job to another until she was forced to return to Garrett's roof like a dependent who owed him gratitude for the right to breathe. She lifted her head, her voice trembling slightly as she asked how he could possibly know about that. Thorne looked at her for a long time, then said he was the client behind that audit contract, or more precisely, his enemy had been behind it, and he had paid Whitlock and Greaves to find the very cash flow she had pointed out. The cash flow that an entire room full of experts had either been bribed or been too incompetent to see. When the final report reached him, clean and useless, he knew someone was hiding something, and it took him months afterward to trace the fact that a low-level assistant had seen the truth and then been silenced for it. He had remembered her name. He said with a naked honesty that chilled her, that he had a perfect memory for the few things in this world that were truly valuable, and a mind that could see a lie buried 6 layers deep while a room full of experts remained blind was rarer than gold. Delia stood there, stunned by the thought that for 2 whole years, while she had believed herself completely invisible, someone had carried the memory of her with him. Then she asked, because she had to ask, what he had bought her for. Thorne stepped 1 pace closer, his gray eyes never leaving her, and said this wasn't pity. He never spent money on anything as frivolous and useless as pity. He said someone was betraying him from within his own organization, an insider who was siphoning funds and hiding the cash flows inside his own books, and every auditor he had hired was either too frightened or had already been bought outright. He needed someone who could read lies in numbers no one else could see. He needed exactly the thing the whole world had thrown away. He needed her. Instead of leading her to some formal dining table, meant to flaunt his wealth, Thorne brought her to a quiet corner beside the glass window, where a small table had been prepared with a simple but elegant meal, pan-seared salmon and roasted vegetables, something warm and real rather than the kind of theatrical display of elaborate dishes she was used to seeing at Garrett's parties. He pulled out her chair for her, then sat down across from her, and in front of him there was only a glass of amber whiskey he still didn't touch, as if it were merely a prop meant to give his hands something to do. He didn't eat. He only watched her eat with a calm attentiveness, and when she began to relax a little, he started asking her questions. Not the dull, polite questions people tossed out just to fill silence, but real questions about how she traced a disguised cash flow, about how she distinguished an accidental error from an intentional lie, about the complex financial structures she had taught herself through long, lonely nights because no one else had been willing to listen when she spoke. And Delia, for the first time in she didn't know how many years, found herself talking. The words kept spilling out, hesitant at first, then more and more alive, because he didn't nod along just to be polite. He truly listened. He asked follow-up questions sharp enough to prove he understood exactly what she was saying. And when she offered a subtle observation about the way an asset could be hidden, the corner of his eye flickered with something it took her a moment to recognize as approval. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at her as a mind worth debating instead of a burden to be endured. The conversation lasted for hours, sliding from numbers into deeper things, and at some point he asked what she would want to do if every resource in the world were in her hands. And she answered, almost in a whisper, that she would want to follow hidden streams of money to return justice to people who had been robbed in silence, people without enough power for anyone to bother listening to them. Thorne set his whiskey down, and this time his voice was noticeably softer, as he said she was not at all the pale, ordinary thing her family had tried to make her believe she was for so many years. She asked quietly what he thought they believed she was, already used to hearing people list her flaws so often that she braced herself for the blow. But he only looked at her and said they didn't say anything at all. They didn't say she was bad, didn't call her ugly or useless. They simply said nothing. And it was that silent emptiness, that absolute disregard, that was the greatest violence they could inflict on her, because they had tried to convince her that she occupied no place in this universe, that she didn't truly exist. The sentence struck something Delia had buried so deep she thought it had died long ago, and before she could stop it, one hot tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't sob. She had sworn off the fragile luxury of tears on the day Garrett sold her late father's antique watch to pay his club membership dues, had taught herself that tears were only for people who were protected and loved. But sitting here, beneath the city lights and beneath the complete, unwavering attention of this man, her walls gave way and that single tear slid down as silent proof of all the years she had known starving for the most basic respect owed to a human being. Thorne rose, moved around the table with quiet grace, then stopped only a few inches away from her, close enough for her to feel his presence but without touching her, without forcing that closeness upon her. He allowed her the right to choose. He simply stood there, and through that absolute restraint, he gave her something no one had ever given her before. The right to decide who could come near her, and how near they could come. And for Delia, who had been pushed around and sold all her life without ever being asked, that small gesture felt gentler than any embrace. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Delia had never known before, a rhythm of quiet evenings on the highest floor of the glass tower, where she sat for hours before thick stacks of financial records from the Mercer Empire, tracing each current of money through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts while Thorne worked nearby, the two of them sharing a silence that wasn't suffocating at all, but strangely familiar instead. She was given her own office, a level of access even his longest-serving associates didn't have, and every morning a car came to take her there and bring her back, steady and safe. So much so that even Garrett didn't dare meddle. When he knew she was under the protection of a name the whole city treated with caution. The bond between them grew, not in the rushed romantic fashion of cheap stories, but built on a much stronger foundation, mutual respect, and the deep understanding that both of them were lonely people who had grown used to living behind walls of their own making. She realized he was a dangerous man in the most literal sense, a man whose quietest word was enough to make powerful men tremble, a man who carried within him the coldness of someone who had done things she didn't want to know too clearly, and yet with her, he had never been that. With her, he was always restrained, always composed, always allowing her to be herself. One night, as rain lashed against the glass wall and the city below blurred into smeared streaks of light, Delia let slip a question she had been holding inside for many days, asking why he could trust and empower her, a stranger so deeply, while treating his own people with such cold suspicion. Thorne was silent for a very long time, his gray eyes following the raindrops sliding down the glass, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet depth she had never heard before. He told her, not through details but through the silences between the words, that he once had a younger brother, a boy named Leo, whom he had raised and protected since they were both very young. After their parents were gone, and left him with an underworld full of danger and a little brother to keep safe, he told her that he had placed his whole trust in one man, a man he had considered a brother by blood, a right hand he trusted so completely that he had entrusted Leo's life to him, and that this very man, out of greed, and because of a promise of power from a rival family, had betrayed him in the cruelest way one human being could betray another. He didn't say how Leo had died. He only said that on the night he lost his younger brother, he also buried the part of himself that still knew how to trust, that he had learned a lesson he would never forget, that trust was the most expensive luxury in the world, and its price was always paid in the blood of the people we loved. Since then, he had chosen cruelty as armor, chosen solitude as a way to make sure no one could ever be taken from him again, and he had lived that way for many years, a cold king ruling over an empire where he trusted no one. Delia sat listening, her heart twisting, because she understood that loneliness too well, the way people built walls not because they hated the world, but because they were afraid of it, afraid to let themselves be hurt one more time. She didn't offer hollow words of comfort. She only gently placed her hand on the table, near his but not touching it, a gesture that mirrored exactly what he had done for her on that first night, giving him the right to choose the distance. And Thorne looked down at those two hands resting close together for a long time, the man who had never allowed anyone to touch his wound. Then very slowly, he let his cold fingers brush against hers, and in that small, silent moment, the two loneliest people in the room found in each other something they had both believed they had lost forever. The feeling of truly being seen by another person. That fragile feeling that had only just begun to bloom didn't last long, because only a few days later, one morning when Delia stepped into her private office on the upper floor, she knew at once that something was wrong. It wasn't an obvious disturbance, not papers scattered across the floor or drawers yanked open, but something far more subtle, the eerie instinct of someone who had survived by noticing the details other people missed. Her computer had been restarted at midnight, even though she was certain she had shut it down before leaving. Several folders on her desk had been shifted a few inches from where she had left them, aligned so perfectly that they were too perfect, as if a careful hand had put them back, but couldn't quite recreate the natural disorder that belonged only to her. Her heart began to beat faster as she sat down and started reviewing every trace in the system, and what she found turned her spine cold. Someone had accessed her computer during the night, and they hadn't been searching at random. They had gone straight to the exact files she had been tracing, the exact anonymous cash flow she had only just begun to peel apart over the past few days. the exact hidden current she believed would lead her to the insider. Someone had tried to copy them, and when that failed, because of the extra encryption she had quietly installed herself, they had tried to delete them. But Delia, with the wary instinct of someone who had once been silenced and had learned the costly lesson that one must never trust a single copy, had backed everything up somewhere no one could touch. The intruder had left empty-handed, but they had left behind a message so clear it was chilling. They knew. They knew what she was doing, knew what she was getting close to, and that meant the insider Thorne was hunting wasn't some vague ghost somewhere far away, but someone standing close enough to know exactly what she was tracing, someone who could move through this tower, someone with access to places only a very small number of people were allowed to enter. She called Thorne, and he was there within minutes, his face terrifyingly still as he listened to her lay out every detail in a voice she was trying to keep calm, even though her hands were trembling. He didn't say much. He only stood there, looking out at the sea of city lights, and Delia could feel the cold anger rising beneath that absolute stillness, an anger more frightening than any shouting, because it was completely controlled. When he turned back, his eyes had changed, and she realized that to him, this was no longer only about a traitor lurking inside his organization. It was about the fact that the traitor had just reached a hand toward her. He said, very softly, that from this moment on, she wouldn't go anywhere alone again. One of his men, a quiet man named Frank Doyle, whom she had seen always standing a few steps from Thorne, would stay near her at all times. Her schedule would change constantly, so no one could predict it. She would move into a secure apartment inside this very tower, below his floor, where no one could reach her without him knowing. Delia started to object, started to say she didn't need to be watched over like some fragile object, but then she looked into his eyes and understood that this wasn't control. It was something else. This was a man who had once lost someone he loved because he had placed their safety in the wrong hands, and now he was quietly doing the only thing he knew how to do to protect something he didn't yet dare to name. He didn't say he was worried about her. He never said things like that, but in the way he arranged every layer of protection around her, careful and airtight, Delia read the thing he wouldn't say aloud, and for the first time in her life, the feeling of being pushed into danger came with a strange, choking feeling she had never known before. The feeling that at last, someone in this world considered her safety worth protecting. After the night of the break-in, Delia threw herself into the work with an almost merciless focus, because now she understood that every hour the insider remained hidden was one more hour of danger for both her and the man who had placed his trust in her. She moved into the secure apartment just below Thorne's floor, and the long nights now passed beneath the light of a single desk lamp. Among stacks of statements and balance sheets spread across the table, while Frank Doyle stood silent guard somewhere outside the door. She worked the way she worked best, without rushing, without missing anything, following one thread at a time through the maze someone had so carefully woven. And after many nights of painstaking work, she finally found it. A cash flow. Not large enough to draw attention at a glance, but cleverly broken into dozens of seemingly harmless transactions, scattered across many months, disguised beneath the cover of legitimate operating expenses. But when Delia fit all those small pieces together in the right way, a picture emerged, and that picture stole her breath. Someone was steadily pulling enormous sums of money out of Thorne's empire, siphoning it little by little, with the patience of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, then moving it through the same chain of shell companies she had become far too familiar with, the kind of layered structure designed not to make money, but to make money disappear from sight. And all those currents, after passing through every layer of disguise, ultimately converged at a single point, an offshore account hidden so carefully that it was almost impossible to trace, an account that carried no one's name. That was the insider's trail. She was certain of it down to her bones, because no legitimate transaction needed to hide itself that deeply. But at the very moment she thought she had caught him, the final wall rose before her. The account had no name. It was protected by a legal shield so thick that it could belong to anyone, a faceless ghost standing behind the entire conspiracy. She had the money trail. She had proof of betrayal. But she was still missing the most important piece, who was standing at the other end of these numbers. She sat silently before the screen for a long time, both exhilarated and discouraged, feeling like someone who had walked almost the entire road, only to stumble against a locked door just before the finish. It was then that Thorne stepped in, carrying 2 cups of black coffee, and he recognized the tension on her face at once. She explained her discovery to him, one step at a time, and she saw his eyes darken when he realized just how close she had come, closer than anyone he had ever hired. He leaned down beside her shoulder to look at the screen, following the numbers her finger was pointing to, and in that moment she suddenly realized how close he was standing, close enough for her to feel the rare warmth radiating from a man she had always thought of as cold. She turned her face and caught his eyes looking at her, no longer with the searching gaze of those early days, but with something deeper, warmer, something both of them were trying to hold back. For one long heartbeat, neither of them moved, the distance between them shrinking to only a few inches, and Delia could feel her heart pounding inside her chest. But then Thorne was the one who stepped back first, slowly straightening, and she understood that he wasn't retreating out of coldness, but because of the iron discipline he forced upon himself, the restraint of a man who had decided he would never take advantage of her dependence, would never become another person who took something from her when she didn't truly have the power to choose. He only said softly that she had done very well, that they were getting very close, and that he would mobilize every resource to uncover the name behind that account. But they both knew, in the silence still lingering between them, that something else had also come very close, something dangerous in an entirely different way. But the danger drawing closer didn't come from the direction Delia expected. It came from inside the small circle of people Thorne still trusted. Frank Doyle, the quiet right hand who had followed Thorne for many years, was the one who planted that seed of doubt. One evening, after Delia had returned to her secure apartment, Frank came to see Thorne in the dark office and told him in the steady, cautious voice of an old soldier that there were things about this girl that didn't sit right with him. He reminded him that she had appeared in Thorne's life far too conveniently, brought to his casino on the exact night he happened to be there, by the very hand of a stepfather as indebted and corrupt as Garrett Hale. He said she knew too much, traced the money faster than any auditor he had ever hired, almost so fast it became suspicious, as if she had already known where to look. And then he asked the most poisonous question of all, the question he knew would cut straight into Thorne's old wound, whether this entire thing, from the humiliating auction to the tears, might be an elaborate trap, a Trojan horse planted by his enemies inside the very heart of his empire, taking advantage of the one weakness a lonely man like him had never expected he still possessed. Those words gnawed at Thorne all night, because he had trusted completely once, and that trust had been repaid with the highest price of his life, with Leo, and now the old voice of fear rose again, whispering that he was repeating the same mistake from years ago, that he was once again allowing some soft feeling to cloud his judgment. The next morning he summoned Delia upstairs, and she walked in to find a completely different man, not the man who had let his fingers touch hers in the rain, but the Thorne Mercer the whole city feared, cold, distant, his gray eyes as flat as ice. He began questioning her, not about the books, but with questions sharp as knives, about how she had found everything so quickly, about what Garrett had really said to her, about whether anyone else had told her where to look. It took Delia a while to understand what was happening, and when she did, an old familiar pain rose inside her, the pain of someone once again being suspected, accused, seen as a lie. But she didn't cry, she didn't beg him to believe her, didn't speak the meaningless vows any traitor could have spoken. Because she had learned long ago that tears and promises carried no weight with people who had already decided not to trust you. Instead, she did the only thing she knew how to do, the thing that defined who she was. She placed a thick stack of files on the desk in front of him, opened it to the exact pages she had marked, and said in a voice so calm it was chilling that if he thought she was a trap, then he didn't need to believe a word she said. He only needed to read. She said numbers didn't know how to lie, that they had no loyalty to anyone, feared no one, couldn't be bought or threatened, that everything she had found was right there in black and white before his eyes, and he could trace every step himself to verify it if he didn't trust her. Then she stepped back, folded her arms, and let the truth speak for itself. Thorne looked at her for a long time, then bent his head and began to read. He read page after page, following every cash flow, every connection, every layer of disguise she had patiently peeled away, and the more he read, the more the ice on his face began to melt. Because he realized that no traitor would expose the very money trail of the mastermind. No Trojan horse would hand him the map leading to the very person who had planted it. When he looked up, his eyes had changed, and inside them was something Delia had never seen in him before: shame. He said softly, almost without sound, that he was sorry, 2 words she suspected he hadn't spoken to anyone in many years, and in that moment, the crack that had just opened between them closed again. But this time it closed stronger, because it had been tested by fire and truth. The fragile piece that had just been mended was torn apart on a gloomy Tuesday morning, when Frank Doyle reported that someone claiming to be family was insisting on seeing Delia in the tower lobby. And when she came down, she saw Garrett Hale standing there, wearing his most expensive suit, his face carrying the dangerous smugness of a gambler who believed he still had one card hidden up his sleeve. He didn't circle around the point. He said he had come to give her good news, that her future had already been arranged, and that she was about to become the wife of Councilman Victor Ashford. Delia laughed at the absurdity of it, and answered that he had already sold her to Mercer, that she wasn't an object he could put up for sale a second time. But Garrett only smirked, and that smile turned her insides cold, because she realized he had calculated this from the beginning. He said, in the patient tone of a man explaining something obvious to a child, that the arrangement with Mercer had been nothing more than debt repayment, $1,200,000 to erase his gambling debt, no more and no less. There wasn't a single binding document, no contract stating that she belonged to Mercer for life, or that she wasn't allowed to belong to another man. Mercer had paid, the debt had been erased, and in Garrett's twisted view, the matter between him and Mercer ended there, cleanly. As for Delia, he still had every right of a stepfather, and he intended to use that right to marry her off to the highest bidder once again. He wanted to have it both ways. He had pocketed Mercer's money, and now he would pocket whatever Ashford was willing to pay to have her. A far more enormous sum, because the councilman on the campaign trail didn't merely need a wife. He needed a spotless image, a moving story about a wretched woman he had rescued and raised up. Delia trembled with anger, and she said she would never agree, that he couldn't force her to do anything anymore. But that was exactly when Garrett pulled out his cruelest card. He said, very slowly so every word could sink into her, that he had documents in his possession that could send her sister, Brooke, to prison. He spoke of financial fraud, papers bearing Brooke's signature, evidence showing that her younger sister had been involved in an embezzlement scheme. Delia went utterly still, because she knew Brooke could never be capable of doing such a thing, and in one flashing instant she understood the sickening truth, that Garrett had staged the whole thing, had tricked Brooke into signing papers the girl didn't understand, had carefully set a trap in advance to use as a weapon when he needed it. And as if that still wasn't enough, he added that, if she dared resist, he would spread the story through Chicago high society that she was a woman who had been sold, a piece of merchandise that had passed through the hands of a mob boss, enough to destroy not only her reputation but also the image Ashford needed. He gave her exactly 3 days to think, 3 days to prepare herself to become a grateful and obedient political wife, or else Brooke would go to prison, and Delia would be ruined beyond repair. Then he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Delia rooted in place in the middle of the lobby, feeling as if the tower's glittering walls were closing around her into a prison. He had set a perfect trap, a trap built on the very weakness he knew best in her, that she would always choose to carry pain herself, rather than watch someone she loved suffer. And what hurt her most wasn't the thought of having to marry a man she despised, but the thought that she would have to bring all the ugly, humiliating disorder of this ordinary world before Thorne. And she was afraid that its filth would stain the clean, precious thing the two of them had quietly built between ledger pages and rain-soaked nights. Delia returned to her office with the name Victor Ashford, ringing in her head like an alarm bell, and a cold instinct she couldn't brush aside began clawing at her. The name felt familiar in a way that unsettled her, not the ordinary familiarity of a politician people saw in the newspapers, but something deeper, like a sound she had heard somewhere inside the maze of numbers she had been living with for weeks. She sat down before the screen, and instead of tracing the money flows as usual, this time she did the opposite. She began with the man, Victor Ashford, and worked backward toward the numbers. She dug through the councilman's public records, the list of donors to his campaign, the companies in which he held shares, the nonprofit organizations carrying his name, and she began comparing them, one by one, to the chain of shell companies she knew by heart, the chain that had swallowed the money being siphoned from Thorne's empire. And then she found it, a name, a law firm, discreet and shadowy, appearing in both places at once, a small link anyone else would have overlooked, but to Delia's eyes, it burned bright like a fire in the night. The law firm representing one of Ashford's donors was also the same law firm that had built the legal shield protecting that nameless offshore account, the account where all the stolen money eventually flowed. The two roads she had thought were separate, one leading to the faceless insider in Thorne's organization, the other to the councilman Garrett was forcing her to marry, were in fact the same road, leading back to the same man. Victor Ashford was the traitor. She sat frozen, both hands gone cold, as the whole horrifying picture opened before her. Ashford had been quietly draining Thorne's empire from the inside for months, hiding behind the mask of a respectable politician, and now he had realized that a deadly danger was closing in. Her, the only person who had read the truth in the numbers, the only person getting very close to his nameless account. And so he had devised a move so cruel it was almost perfect. He would marry her. He would use that marriage not because he needed a clean wife for his campaign as Garrett believed, but for a far darker reason, to control her, to silence her, to turn the only person who could expose him into a wife bound by law and unable to testify against her husband. Garrett, blinded by greed, was only an accidental pawn in this game, a man helping Ashford set the trap without even knowing whom he was truly serving. The break-in at her office, the attempt to delete the files, everything was clear now. It had been Ashford trying to seal the gap he realized she was about to find, and when that failed, he had shifted to another strategy, using Garrett and the trap laid for Brooke to force her into a marriage that would bind her hands forever. The two dangers Delia had believed were separate, the threat to her family and the threat to Thorne's empire, were really two sides of the same blade pointed at her. She sat there for a long time in the dark office, her heart pounding hard, and she understood that now she had no choice left. The ugly chaos she had been too afraid to bring to Thorne was no longer only her family's private matter. It had become a direct threat to him, to everything he had built. She couldn't keep this to herself for even one more second. She had to tell him who the real enemy was, and she had to tell him tonight. But before she could leave the office to find Thorne, something held her in place. The professional instinct forged through years of discipline whispering to her that she still hadn't seen the whole picture, that a conspiracy this large couldn't possibly be the work of Victor Ashford alone. An insider, no matter how greedy and cunning, couldn't drain an empire as powerful as Mercer's for months without being discovered, couldn't build such intricate layers of cover on his own, couldn't possess enough power by himself to dare reach into the den of a sleeping lion. There had to be someone behind him, someone strong enough to protect him, someone who would profit from Thorne's collapse. And so Delia turned back to the screen, plunging into one final long night of digging, this time not searching for money but for connections, for hidden handshakes between powers. She followed the stolen money farther, beyond Ashford's nameless account, and discovered that the money didn't stop there. It kept flowing, laundered once more through even more sophisticated channels, before finally pouring into a place that made the blood in her body turn cold. Another family, an old underworld power whose name even she, an outsider to this world, had heard in whispers, a rival bloodline that had coveted Mercer territory for years, but had never been strong enough to face him directly, and now everything became chillingly clear. Ashford wasn't acting alone. He was the knife that rival family had driven straight into the heart of Thorne's empire. This wasn't a simple embezzlement by a greedy insider. This was a coup, calculated with cold patience over many years, a plan to bleed Thorne's financial strength from within, weakening him little by little until he was vulnerable enough to be swallowed whole. The stolen money wasn't only enriching Ashford, it was being used to buy loyalty, to fund men who would turn their coats, to build an underground force right beneath Thorne's feet without him ever knowing. And the marriage to her, the move Delia had thought was only meant to silence her, now revealed an even more poisonous layer of meaning. Victor Ashford needed a clean cover, the spotless image of a respectable politician with a rescued, unfortunate wife, because once the coup was complete and the Mercer Empire collapsed, he would need to stand steady beneath the lights of public scrutiny as a man entirely untouched, with no one able to trace the dirty hands behind him. She wasn't merely a danger to be removed. She was a piece in a much larger game, the final piece in a plan to seize everything that belonged to Thorne. Delia sat motionless in the dark room, and for the first time she felt the full terrifying scale of what she had accidentally stepped into. This was no longer the story of a miserable girl being sold by her stepfather. It was no longer the story of a forced marriage to a man she despised. This was life and death, not only for her but for Thorne, for the entire empire he had built and protected with blood. If she made one wrong move, if she alerted the enemy too soon, it wouldn't only be Brooke who went to prison, and it wouldn't only be Delia's reputation that was destroyed. The man who had seen her when the whole world ignored her would be swallowed by the very force quietly tightening around him. And what made her tremble most, as she stood and walked toward the elevator, with the stack of files clutched tightly in her arms, wasn't fear for herself, but the thought that she was holding a truth that could save Thorne, and that the very same truth, if it fell into the enemy's hands, could kill him. Delia found Thorne in the office on the highest floor, and she laid everything out before him, hiding nothing anymore, no longer afraid that her own chaos would stain his world, because now she understood that his world was the very thing under threat. She placed each folder on the desk in the exact order she had pieced them together, and she said, in the chillingly calm voice of someone presenting a truth too large to allow emotion to interfere, that the insider he had been hunting all this time was Victor Ashford. That the nameless account swallowing his money belonged to him, and that behind Ashford stood an entire rival family pulling the strings, a coup woven over many years to drain and devour his empire from within. She told him about her role in that plan, about how Ashford meant to use the marriage to turn her into both a pawn and a clean public shield. Thorne listened to her from beginning to end without interrupting once, and she could see something happening to him as she spoke, a silent and frightening transformation. When Ashford's name was spoken, something in his gray eyes darkened, and his entire body seemed to go unnaturally still, the stillness of a hunter who had just caught the scent of prey, or more precisely, of a lion who had just discovered who had crept into his territory. He didn't shout, he didn't break anything. His anger didn't explode. It froze, so cold that Delia could almost feel the temperature in the room drop, and she understood that this was Thorne Mercer at his most dangerous, not when he lost his temper, but when he became completely silent. He rose, walked to the glass wall, and stood there for a long time looking down at the city as if he were measuring it, calculating every move on a chessboard only he could see. Then he turned back, and what he said startled Delia, because she had braced herself to hear him declare that he would crush both men before the night was over. Instead he said, with a blunt and naked honesty she hadn't expected, that he couldn't. He said he had more than enough power to make Victor Ashford and Garrett Hale disappear from her life with a single flick of his hand, but that would be the way of a man who had already lost. Because if Ashford simply vanished, the family behind him would know the conspiracy had been exposed, and they would retreat into the shadows only to strike again from another direction he couldn't predict, and next time they wouldn't make the mistake of leaving a financial trail behind. To destroy them at the root, to protect not only her but Brooke as well, he needed to do it cleanly, legally, undeniably. He needed to turn the numbers she had found into a legal case strong enough to hand to federal authorities, a weapon even the rival family's power and money couldn't silence. But a case like that needed time to build. Every lead had to be traced, every piece of evidence reinforced, every gap sealed, and they had only 3 days. He looked straight into her eyes and admitted, with a sincerity she had never seen in a man so powerful, that 3 days wasn't enough to do everything perfectly, that he couldn't simply snap his fingers and solve it all like a god, that there were limits even he couldn't cross. And it was that admission, that moment, when the man who had seemed almost all-powerful lowered himself into the shape of a human being with real limits, that made something inside Delia steady again, because it meant she wasn't a helpless princess waiting to be rescued. It meant he needed her, not as something to protect, but as an equal partner in a game of life and death. She stepped forward and stood beside him at the glass wall, and said that in that case, they would have to find another way, a way she could actively help shape. because she was tired of being a piece on someone else's chessboard, and it was time she picked up a piece of her own. Throughout that first long night of the 3 short days they had, Delia sat alone amid a sea of files and realized that Garrett's most powerful weapon wasn't in the forged documents he was holding, but in the element of surprise, in the destructive force of a secret released at just the right moment to shock. Any weapon built on surprise shared the same fatal weakness. It became useless once it was no longer a secret, and so a plan began to form in her mind, a plan so bold that at first even she shivered at the thought of it. But the more she considered it, the more she saw it was the only path left. If Garrett meant to use the trap he had laid for Brooke, and the story meant to smear Delia as a way to control her, then she would strip both weapons from his hands before he had the chance to raise them. She would detonate the bomb herself, at a moment of her choosing, in a way she controlled, so when it exploded, the shrapnel would fly back toward him instead of toward her. She set to work with all the cold precision that had come to define her. First, she built a complete file proving Brooke's innocence, tracing every transaction in the fraud Garrett had staged, peeling it apart layer by layer to show clearly that Brooke had been deceived into signing, that the girl was only a pawn being used, and that the one who had truly designed the entire embezzlement scheme, the one who had truly pocketed the money, was Garrett Hale. Numbers didn't know how to lie, and in Delia's hands, they told a story that couldn't be denied. Once that file was complete, with no gaps left open, she moved to the second step, the step that required not accounting skill, but courage. She contacted a woman named Priya Nair, an investigative financial journalist known for being sharp and merciless, someone who had spent her entire career exposing powerful people hiding behind numbers. Reaching out to Priya made Delia's heart pound harder than it had on the night she stepped into Thorne's world, because it meant she was willingly placing the deepest shame of her family into the hands of the person most capable of spreading it the fastest. But that was the very heart of the plan. She met Priya in a quiet coffee shop, and she told her story, but she told it in her own way, framing it not as a filthy scandal, but as the tragedy of a woman manipulated and sold for years by a cruel stepfather. She laid the file proving Brooke's innocence on the table, exposing Garrett as the true architect behind the fraud, and she let Priya see clearly that this wasn't gossip, but evidence, verifiable numbers. She didn't weep or beg for pity. She presented the truth with the composure of someone who understood the value of proof all too well. Priya, quick to recognize a major story and carrying within herself the instinct to protect the vulnerable, listened with eyes that grew brighter by the moment, and when Delia finished, she placed her hand on the table and said this was a story that needed to be told. Delia knew that within 2 days, the story she had just planted would spread through Chicago high society, like a fire that couldn't be put out, but this time it would spread exactly the way she wanted. When Garrett tried to reveal Brooke's secret to shock people, that secret would no longer be a secret, and worse for him, the truth exposed wouldn't be Brooke's crime, but his own. When he tried to smear Delia as a woman who had been sold, the whole city would already know her as a resilient woman who had survived the cruelty of a manipulator. She had turned his weapon into a bomb that would explode in his own hands. As she left the coffee shop beneath the pale afternoon sunlight, Delia felt something she had never felt in all 27 years of her life. The feeling of someone no longer sitting still and waiting for fate to come down upon her, but standing up and taking hold of it with her own hands. She was no longer merchandise on an auction stage. She had become the author of her own story. The following evening, just as Delia returned to her secure apartment, Frank Doyle reported that a young woman was waiting for her in the lobby, and that she stubbornly refused to explain why, only insisting again and again that she was Delia's sister. Delia froze because in all those years Brooke had never once come to her on her own, had never once broken through the cold distance their entire family had built between the two sisters. When she came down, she found Brooke standing in a shadowed corner, and the beautiful girl who had always seemed so radiant at parties now looked small and trembling, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes red as though she had been crying for a very long time. Brooke lifted her head to look at her sister, and the first thing she said wasn't a greeting, but a confession that she knew, that she had always known. Brooke said that for years, she had watched the way Garrett treated Delia, had seen him push her into the storage room at the end of the hall, had seen him sell her father's watch, had seen him treat her as something invisible, and she had done nothing. She had stayed silent. She said she used to tell herself she was too young, that she couldn't do anything, that it was better not to anger Garrett, so she wouldn't be dragged into it. But now she understood that those were only cowardly excuses for the sin of standing by, while her own sister was crushed day after day without ever speaking up. Delia stood in silence and listened without interrupting, because this was the first time in her life she had ever heard someone in her family acknowledge the truth. All of them had conspired to bury. Then Brooke said she hadn't come only to apologize, because she knew an apology now was far too little and far too late. She had come because she had something she had kept hidden for months out of fear, but now she couldn't stay silent anymore. With shaking hands, she took out her phone and said that a few months earlier, when Garrett had forced her to sign papers she didn't understand, she had sensed that something was wrong, and out of some vague instinct for self-defense, she had secretly recorded it. She played the recording, and in the empty stillness of the lobby, Garrett's voice rang out, thick with liquor and swollen with self-satisfaction, bragging to one of his men about his own cleverness. He described, word by word, how he had staged the entire fraud, how he had tricked that foolish little Brooke into signing the papers so she could become the scapegoat, how he had carefully prepared that trap long ago to use as leverage against both girls when the time came. His voice in the recording left no room for doubt. It was the full confession of the true mastermind, spoken by his own smug mouth. Delia listened with her heart pounding, because she understood instantly the meaning of what had just been placed in her hands. The accounting file she had worked so hard to build proved Brooke's innocence through numbers, but no matter how solid numbers were, they still needed to be explained, and a skilled lawyer could still twist them. But this recording was Garrett's own voice condemning himself, the final piece that transformed her file from a sharp argument into an undeniable verdict. Brooke had given her not only evidence, but the final pin sealing shut the very trap Garrett had laid. Delia took the phone and looked at her sister, the sister she had grown used to thinking of as part of the world that had rejected her, and she realized that perhaps Brooke, too, had always been a prisoner in her own way, a prisoner of fear. She didn't embrace her, not yet, because wounds from years of pain couldn't heal in a single moment. She only nodded, a nod that carried a silent promise, and said she would handle everything, that from now on Brooke didn't need to be afraid anymore. And when Brooke turned and disappeared into the night, Delia tightened her grip around the phone, knowing the balance had just tipped fully in her favor. Victor Ashford's campaign fundraiser was held in the grand ballroom of one of Chicago's most lavish hotels, a glittering event that gathered the city's entire political and financial elite beneath the light of thousands of crystal lamps, a stage perfectly arranged for a reputation to be either affirmed or destroyed before more than 100 of the most powerful pairs of eyes. Delia entered in a simple yet elegant deep blue silk dress, her spine straight, bracing herself for whatever ambush Garrett and the councilman had prepared. She saw the two of them standing near a champagne tower, Garrett with his face flushed red from liquor and impatience, whispering something to Ashford, who held a folded set of documents in his hand with the calm confidence of a snake about to strike. When Delia approached, Ashford gave her a thin smile and spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, saying it was truly a tragedy that her shadowy relationship with a notorious criminal had completely stained her virtue. He raised the documents like a judge preparing to read a sentence, a stack of carefully forged papers painting her as a woman who had been sold, a disturbed troublemaker who had caused problems at her former workplace, a woman with no value left worthy of trust. The music faltered, and hundreds of heads turned toward them, eyes bright with the hungry craving of the upper-class crowd before a scandal about to erupt. Garrett stood beside him with a smirk, certain this blow would crush her. But Delia didn't step back. She stood straight, and she answered in a clear, steady voice that rang cleanly through the sudden silence covering the ballroom, saying that what Ashford held in his hand was nothing but a clumsy forgery, written by desperate men whose own books were about to expose them. And then the unexpected happened, the thing neither Garrett nor Ashford could possibly have foreseen. The crowd didn't laugh at her. The crowd didn't whisper in contempt. Instead, a very different wave of murmuring spread among the guests, a low current carrying sympathy and outrage, but not outrage directed at her. Because the story Delia had placed in the hands of journalist Prienaire 2 days earlier had spread exactly as she had calculated, slipping through drawing rooms, dinner tables, and private conversations all across Chicago high society over the past 48 hours. Everyone in this room already knew. They knew about a resilient woman who had been manipulated and sold for years by a cruel stepfather. They knew about a financial fraud staged to frame an innocent younger sister. They knew the name of the true mastermind, and that name was Garrett Hale. When Ashford raised the forged documents, he wasn't delivering a fatal blow as he believed. He was only confirming before everyone's eyes that he was standing on the side of the villain in a story they had already heard. The eyes that had been fixed on her now shifted to Garrett, and in those eyes there was no longer any amusement at a joke, only cold disgust. Garrett's face went pale, then flushed red again as he realized what was happening. As he understood that the secret weapon he had been sharpening for so long had been stripped from his hand before he ever had the chance to swing it, that the silent stepdaughter he had underestimated all his life had moved one step ahead of him. Ashford, seasoned politician that he was, felt the air in the room turning against him, and for the first time, the confidence on his face began to crack. He glanced around and saw the powerful guests quietly edging away from him, and he understood that the smear campaign had failed completely. But what neither man knew yet, what allowed Delia to stand there, with an almost strange calm in the middle of the storm she had just unleashed, was that this was only the beginning, the first bomb of 2, that this night would witness, and the second bomb was still waiting beyond the door. At the very moment Ashford was scrambling to salvage his collapsing position, the great doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and the air in the room seemed to change at once, as if a cold current had just swept in from the darkness outside. Thorne Mercer stepped inside, and the crowded upper-class gathering automatically parted before him, like water splitting before the prow of a ship, conversations dying away, champagne glasses freezing in midair. He didn't hurry. He crossed the ballroom with the calm, commanding stride of a man who had never needed to rush for anything in his life, his black suit seeming to drink in the light, his gray eyes locked on the 2 men standing beside the champagne tower. He came to stand beside Delia, and his cold, solid presence wrapped around her like a shield. Then he spoke, still in that low, deep voice that didn't need to rise, and told the entire room that if they liked scandals, he had one truly worth hearing. He slipped a hand inside his jacket and drew out a thick file, not the clumsy forged papers Ashford had brought, but real legal documents authenticated and undeniable. He held them up for the entire ballroom to see and declared that his network of attorneys and financial experts, led by the sharpest mind he had ever known, had spent the past days exposing the whole truth. He read it aloud, charge by charge, in the terrifyingly steady voice of a man pronouncing judgment. A massive money laundering network, political bribes, an elaborate embezzlement scheme designed to frame an innocent girl named Brooke Hale, a scheme whose true mastermind was Garrett Hale, and above all, evidence showing the Counsel Skalden Vic Ashford himself stood behind the offshore account, swallowing the dirty money, a traitor conspiring with an underworld power for dark ambitions. Then he let the file fall to the marble floor with a resounding crack and said that all of this evidence had been delivered to federal prosecutors that very night. The silence in the room grew so thick that Garrett's ragged breathing could be heard. Every empire of lies the 2 men had built had collapsed in only a few minutes before the eyes of all the people they needed to deceive. That was when Ashford, cornered with nowhere left to run, lost the last of his composure. His eyes went wild, and in the desperation of a man who had just watched his entire life turn to ash, he reached inside his jacket. The room recoiled in panic, cries breaking out everywhere. In that horrifying moment, when the sudden danger turned toward Delia standing too close, Thorne didn't hesitate. He pivoted and placed himself directly in front of her, using his own body as the shield between her and the threat. A reflex faster than thought, and in that instant, the man who had once sworn he would never let anyone come close enough to be taken from him, was ready to place himself on the edge of life and death for her. But the danger never had time to take shape. Frank Doyle and Thorne's men had already moved in, having anticipated exactly this desperate move, and they subdued Ashford swiftly, decisively, disarming him before he could do anything at all. The situation was fully controlled within only a few short seconds. When everything settled, Delia realized she was standing behind Thorne's broad back, both her hands unconsciously gripping the edge of his jacket. And when he turned to look at her, checking whether she was safe, there was no coldness left in those gray eyes at all. In the sound of sirens beginning to echo from somewhere in the distance, amid the crowd left stunned by what they had just witnessed, the two of them simply stood there looking at each other, and Delia understood that the man who had just shielded her with his own body was no longer the closed-off, lonely soul he had once been. In the chaos slowly settling after the storm, while the upper-class guests still stood frozen in shock, and the sirens of law enforcement drew closer, with every passing moment, Delia felt a hand take hold of hers, and she turned to see Brooke standing there, tears streaming down her beautiful face. This time, her sister no longer kept her distance, no longer carried the fear that had bound her for so many years. She rushed forward and wrapped her arms around Delia, sobbing openly in the middle of the ballroom, in front of everyone, without caring about the eyes around them. Through her broken crying, she said she was sorry, not the cautious apology from the night before, but a shattered cry from all the years she had kept buried inside, that she had stayed silent for too long, had been cowardly for too long, had let her sister endure everything alone when she should have stood beside her from the very beginning. Delia, who had grown used to holding her pain by herself without expecting anyone to share its weight, stood still for a moment inside that embrace, then slowly lifted her arms and held her sister in return, and she felt something inside her chest, a block of ice that had been frozen solid for so many years, begin to melt. She didn't say she forgave her, because some wounds were too deep to be healed by a single sentence, but she tightened her arms around Brooke, and in that hold was a silent promise that from now on, the two sisters would no longer be strangers living beneath the same roof. And then, through her sister's tears, Delia saw her mother. Margot was coming toward her, her legs trembling, her pale face carrying an ocean of emotions she had never dared to reveal. The woman who had stared into her glass of champagne while her daughter was being auctioned off, the mother who had looked away for so many years, now stood before Delia with both hands clenched tightly together. She began to speak, her voice breaking, saying she knew she had no right to ask anything of her, that she had been a terrible mother, a coward who had chosen her own peace over protecting her own flesh and blood. But this time, for the first time in Delia's entire life, she didn't turn away. She stood there, facing her, and said that what Garrett had done was unforgivable, that she should have stopped him long ago, and that no matter how late it was, she wanted Delia to know that she stood on her side. Delia looked at her mother, and she didn't feel the rage she had once thought she would feel, nor was it forgiveness yet, but something quieter, an acknowledgement that at last she had been seen by the very people who had ignored her the longest. The circle of invisibility that had bound her for all 27 years of her life finally closed, not through revenge, but through truth, and she stood there between her sister and her mother, feeling for the first time that she truly belonged somewhere. In the days that followed, the truth revealed that night spread with a force nothing could stop. Victor Ashford was formally indicted by federal prosecutors on a long list of charges, his political career and his respectable mass crumbling into ash, and the rival family that had once pulled his strings quietly withdrew into the darkness, losing the peace they had worked so hard to plant. As for Garrett Hale, the man who had caused it all, he didn't have enough courage to face the ending he had brought upon himself. The moment he realized his empire of lies had collapsed, and the evidence was in the hands of the authorities, he fled the country in the night, disappearing before the arrest warrants could be carried out, leaving behind all the wealth and status he had greedily gathered throughout his life. He fled into a destitute and shameful exile, stripped of everything he had ever valued, and perhaps that was the bitterest punishment for a man who had spent his whole life measuring human worth in money. There was no miracle here, no divine intervention, only truth, patient and unforgiving, finally raising its own voice. The weeks after that storm passed in a peace Delia had never dared to dream of, and life slowly began arranging its broken pieces into a new order. Margot, after everything that had happened, quietly left the house that had once stood as a symbol of Garrett's status, moved into a small, simple apartment in the suburbs, and began the long journey of making amends for all the years she had looked away. She often wrote letters to Delia, sincere letters filled with her regret, and Delia read them, answered with a few words of her own, but she didn't rush to give complete forgiveness, because she had come to understand that real forgiveness wasn't a gift a person forced herself to hand over just to be done with it, but something that had to grow slowly over time, through actions rather than words. She allowed that relationship to heal at its own pace, not pretending every wound had closed, but not slamming the door shut either. And that honesty with her own feelings was the true beginning of healing. As for Thorn, something in him had changed since the night he used his own body to shield her. He began doing something that astonished even the most loyal men around him. He began pulling his empire out of the shadows. He gave Delia a position no one had ever held before, the keeper and overseer of all the books of an empire transforming itself, one step at a time, into a legal and transparent world. She, the woman once rejected by an entire profession for daring to speak the truth, hidden in numbers, now became the guardian of that truth, turning the gift that had once brought punishment down upon her into the foundation of a new beginning. And Thorn, when asked why he had chosen to let go of the ruthless power he had spilled blood to build, only answered that for the first time in his life, he had something worth protecting more than something worth ruling, that her love had given him a reason to stay his hand, to build instead of destroy, to trust instead of suspect. One evening, as they both stood beside the familiar glass wall looking down at the city as its lights began to glow, Thorn said softly that the books had finally balanced, every number had matched, every debt had been paid. And Delia smiled and answered that they balanced because their foundation had been built on truth. Then he turned to her, and the man who had never knelt before anyone in this world, the man who had once laid down a check to buy her on that fateful night, now lowered himself to one knee and placed before her not a check, but a ring. He said, in that deep voice that now carried a tenderness she had helped him find again, that the first time in his life he had bought something he didn't deserve to have, but this time he wouldn't buy anything. This time he would only ask. And Delia, the girl the whole world had once priced as worth less than a single cent, the girl who had learned to shrink herself until she almost disappeared, looked into the gray eyes now filled with a light she had kindled, and she said yes, not because she needed to be rescued, but because she had been seen, fully and exactly as she truly was. And there is a deep truth hidden within this story, a lesson that grows clear when we look at it through the lens of an entire lifetime. The greatest tragedy of a human being isn't being hated, because hatred at least admits that we exist. The greatest tragedy is allowing those who are incapable of seeing our worth to define who we are, shrinking ourselves to fit the narrow space others assign to us, believing that if we stay quiet and faded enough, we'll escape their judgment. But healing begins in the exact moment we reject the false story others have written about us, and find the courage to stand upright in the light, demanding to be seen as we truly are. And love, in its strongest and purest form, is never an exchange meant to raise one's status or purchase safety, but the moment when one person sees through all the outer layers, recognizes the radiant architecture hidden within our soul, and gently helps us rebuild the walls that life has torn down. Because in the end, being seen by another person for our true worth is the deepest form of love one human being can offer another. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video to help us spread meaningful stories and listen to more compelling stories every day. How do you feel about Delia's journey, about Thorn's transformation, about the price of silence and the power of truth? We truly hope to hear the feelings from deep within your heart. So don't hesitate to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, because every story you tell may also touch someone who needs to be heard. Thank you for taking the time to accompany us all the way to the final lines. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.